Hi, I'm Marc Loftus, and thanks for joining us for another post-TV podcast. On this episode, we're going to look at the importance of version control and asset management in real-time workflows that use game engines and next-generation techniques like Gen AI. I'll start by introducing our guests, and we're real happy to have them. First, we'll start with Alex Timbs, who heads up business development for media and entertainment at Dell Technologies. Alex worked at Animal Logic for 15 years, leading technology teams in Sydney, Vancouver, and Los Angeles before joining Dell. He is passionate about bridging the gap between technology and art, and we're happy to have him join us. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me again, Marc. Great
Absolutely.
to speak with you.
Also with Dell is Andy Copeland, who serves as Principal Solutions Architect for Media and Entertainment. Andy has worked in supporting roles for live events, post-production, and game development, and has seen some of the most challenging workflows in the business. He joined Dell Technologies from Industrial Light and Magic, where he worked as a senior systems engineer, and before his time at ILM, Andy worked as a senior engineer for PlayStation in their game development studios. He's passionate about game development, obviously, as well as virtual production, audio, and motion graphics. Andy, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And joining us from Perforce is a visual effects specialist and solutions engineer, Jase Lindgren. Jase is passionate about all things VFX and has been involved in the film and television industry for over a decade. With Perforce, Jase is helping to transform workflows, providing VFX animation, virtual production, and game developers with tools to improve productivity. Jase, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Excellent. So really impressive backgrounds on all of you. I think that makes for a great discussion. Obviously, like I said in the intro, we're looking at the implementation of real-time workflows using game engines and the importance of version control on that. And I know each of you come at it from a different angle, but maybe we could start just by talking about the concept itself of using real-time game engines for workflows and how they're changing the landscape for both VFX and game development. Is there somebody that wants to start off with that?
Yeah, I can have a stab at that, Marc.
Go ahead, Alex.
So look, my view of it is that this has all been driven by what we've witnessed for a number of years now, which is convergence, where you've seen the traditional lines of delineation between different disciplines within content creation starting to collapse and becoming very difficult to distinguish between them. And by that, I mean, lines like that used to be drawn, like we'd have broadcast separate to gaming, and streaming would be separate again, social, etc. And we've seen it, all of those start to become very blurry and collapse around gaming. And you asked, to answer your question, why that's happening. I think it's happening because of a number of factors, but one of the strongest drivers is really what game engines, I should say, delivers in terms of functionality and outcomes to their users. And from my perspective, it is being driven by a matter of being able to make much better creative decisions, because you've got much more real time and a lot more context to make those decisions. Therefore, you can iterate a lot faster. Therefore, your pipeline becomes better and your creative distillation is a lot better. Your output is obviously going to be a lot better. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about everything from, digital twins through to, extended reality with virtual production sets using real-time or in-camera VFX, I should say. I'm also talking about the sort of offline, if you will, use of in-camera VFX, where you'll have an artist sitting at a workstation using Unreal Engine as an example, driving real-time scenes. So a single artist can now become a hero artist instead of needing lots of groups of people necessarily to produce an outcome. And in addition to that, there's new technologies coming all the time, like neural radiance fields and photogrammetry, and we're able to capture real life and create 3D assets a lot quicker using those as well and bring them into the game engine. And these game engines platforms are leading to, I believe, higher quality through the increased context that we discussed, which leads to that higher confidence decision making. They've got a lower cost to entry. They're taking advantage of the very fast GPUs that are on the market now. So we've also had this kind of point in time where the GPUs have actually become fast enough to do what they need to do. And we're able to add things like realistic physics and ray tracing into these scenes really quickly. I'll leave it at that because I'm sure other people have got lots of other things they want to talk about.
Sure. Jase or Andy, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Alex, when talking about the way that iteration is speeding up so much now, and that we're seeing, on the one hand, this greater and greater and greater demand for content from viewers and the people who want to find new shows to watch or new films to watch, and a challenge to make enough for them. And so I think there's two parts to it. One is that the real-time technologies drastically decrease the waiting around for render times, and they allow us to have that immediate feedback like you were just talking about, where a director could come check out over your shoulder while you're working on it as an artist and say, hey, can you show me what you're doing? Oh, can you tweak that a little? And you can do it, and they can see it immediately in real time, and you can make changes. So we're able to create better art faster, which is kind of a win-win for everybody involved. And I would say also a little bit more enjoyable to work with. I'm thinking about coming from the earlier days of 3D art for myself, where it's slow and cumbersome and you need an incredibly expensive computer to do it. And even then it's still really slow, and you might have to wait overnight to even see if what you did worked. So the fact that we're moving to real time from there is amazing, and has made a huge difference for artists, especially as more and more studios are embracing this.
You look at the virtual production scenario, for example, and in-camera VFX, where it's all being captured right there at the production stage. Obviously, you're preparing for it by having all of that background imagery, but it's really changing the way post-production is done, because by capturing it in camera, there is supposed to be less of a post-production process down the road. So it's kind of like, I guess, just refocusing where that's all coming together, back end now moving up to the front end more so, and the game engines are allowing you to do that.
Yeah, I'll look on my comment on that, if I may. So that is a really good point, Marc, is it is changing the way that you do produce content, and its success is based on the ability to change your pipeline, and in particular, your creative decision makers' approach to making content. So a director or art director need to have a clearer vision of what they want to create up front in these projects. Yeah. Whereas previously they've used the pipeline as an exploration, a period of exploring their ideas. And in my experience, like animation, visual effects, the final images, 90% of them are made in the last 3 months, because that's when they're running out of money or time and they're forced to make decisions and lock things in. Whereas this, you're going to need to have a much clearer vision up front. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Andy.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. It was, you force the decision makers to make decisions at the beginning rather than later on in post. But it's an interesting world, because so like everyone's kind of been touching on it, but this is where we're seeing the most pain in media companies as well. It's like everything can happen so much faster. It's really good, and everyone's creating more, and it's all iterative, and that's great. Apart from the fact that everything is exploding out of control in terms of everything. So where we used to have asset like scope creep of stuff, and you may hit a petabyte of raw assets, you're now doing that on steroids, and things are just growing and growing and growing because people can iterate so fast. So there are physical constraints that come along with this, and we've noticed that both sides of the fence are now kind of merging into each other. So artists from game are moving into film, and lighters from film are moving into game, and all this kind of stuff happens. And both worlds have very different ways of working. In the film world, it's all about asset management. In the game world, it's all about version control. And trying to teach either side to do the other one is interesting. I'm sure Jase will get into that in a bit, but it's that's part of the problem. Is like we're used to working with code and keeping everything versioned. It's not. How do we deal with 6 petabytes of assets? Like, what do we do with that?
I was going to throw that to you, Jase. Similar question. You look at a traditional workflow, the way content evolves from production through to post-production, and how assets evolve. And now you have that changing a lot, where a lot of those elements are created and put up front for the in-camera visual effects capture and stuff. How does that affect managing, tracking assets, and how is Perforce addressing these newer workflows?
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up, because I feel like there's this interesting thing where, as Andy was mentioning, on the software development side of things, we've had version control for decades. And that's just a normal thing that everyone in that industry is so used to. It's hard to imagine life without it. And then on the other hand, coming from my background as a VFX artist, that's not something that we ever knew about. And so what I think has been interesting is that we've seen this move from, like, if you think about early software development, you might have a game or an application that's just one big block of code that one, maybe two people wrote, and that those were programs. That was it. And then as those teams grew and as things became more complicated, we figured out how to break up our software into multiple pieces. So we have all these different libraries and different pieces of code and modules that we're using so that we can have a larger team that are all specializing in different parts of it, working on various things. And we have something like version control to make sure that we're all keeping those up to date while we have this ever expanding number of files that are involved in making a program. And then we kind of have a similar trend, but that's lagged a little bit behind, I would say, in terms of the film industry, where if you think about a program like Photoshop, where everything that you do is all inside of one file, it's not really broken up into others. They've started introducing more of those features in Photoshop now. But then if you look at something like Premiere or Final Cut or After Effects or something like that, where your project file is small and references a whole bunch of other files. And as we're moving to game engines, that's gone from, I might be working on a project that references 10 or 20 files, to I'm now working on one scene that references 50,000 files.
Mm-hmm.
And so the scope of just how many files you have to manage has very quickly moved to a level that's not manageable to do manually. And that's what still a lot of studios that are doing more traditional 3D are doing, is effectively a manual process with a little bit of custom tooling that they've written on top to make that a little bit less painful. And that's kind of where that asset management rather than version control side comes in. Whereas with version control, you're able to more quickly access changes and update changes to a large number of files without you needing to manually go in and change every single path. So that if I make a change and there's 20 other artists that are going to be interacting with the file that I just changed, they're all able to get that and know they have the latest, instead of needing to cross-reference with a different database and make sure their paths are updated and all of those sorts of things. So to come back to your question about how Perforce is helping with that, it's kind of fun that the VFX industry, which is where my background is coming to use game engines and learning more about the way game developers have had to manage these huge amounts of files. And we were already in that industry with Perforce. And so it's kind of like, hey, we're looking for a solution to this problem. Oh, there's been a solution for 20 years. Cool, let's learn how to use that. But to Andy's point, it is a little bit of a painful process of learning that, though, because it's a very different way of thinking about things.
I'm always curious when it comes to asset management or version control as to whether the asset is being, kind of backed up or referenced through metadata, meaning like, okay, version 1 was this, version 2 was this, and we're adding metadata to it and changing, or are you keeping actual copies of each of those versions, and does that become a storage issue? Or ultimately, is the final version just the first version with so much more metadata added to it that that's what you're managing?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So the early days of version control, Git, for example, when it's working with text files, it is just storing, okay, here's the first file, we've stored it, and now here's the second file. We're just going to store what's different between this one and the first one. And then the third one, okay, let's store what's different between this one to the second one back to the first one. And so you gradually get this chain of like a string of different changes that you've added along the way. And when we were in the days where our computers could only store a few kilobytes of data, and so a text file could be too large for your computer, which is kind of mind-blowing to think about today, the idea that a text file could be the thing you don't have space for.
Yeah.
But it was needed for that. But what we found now is that because the complexity of files has gotten so much larger and that storage has become so much cheaper, that actually storing unique versions, like storing each version of the file, actually ends up being cheaper and faster than trying to do that calculation of the difference between two of them.
That's
So
interesting.
if you think of, that especially as you add on change after change after change, the amount of compute time it would take to calculate what the file is now would be much slower and much more expensive than just storing another copy of the file. However, we do compress them and things to try to save on space. But yeah, it is actually storing a different one because that's the more economical option.
Well, when you think of one of these animated projects, a Lego movie or, a Pixar movie, and you think of all the elements, all the assets, the characters, the backgrounds, the lighting, the textures, and all of these things, you're looking at millions of individual assets there. So it's incredible to think that is going to be, somebody has to kind of oversee that, or that there's a system that is overseeing it without it being a manual system, because it's unmanageable manually.
This is very true, Mark. And having worked on movies that used a lot of assets to make the films, it's definitely the case. And the why you're doing this, at the end of the day, if you go right up the stack, the reason you're doing it is to make collaboration low friction, right? And you're doing that. You're breaking things down into their smallest, most atomic elements for a reason, and you're tracking all of those dependencies because it allows you to tag and track and essentially automate anything that would normally get in the way of efficient collaboration. This includes things like, better data management, being able to deprecate older files very efficiently because you're aware of how they sit in relation to other files, how they relate to the current versions, the approved versions for a film. And so therefore you're able to much more efficiently manage your storage, but you're also more efficiently able to get the right data to the right people at the right time. They're not looking at a version that's 6 months old and working on that. They know exactly every minute of every day what the latest version is and how they relate, what those dependencies are. And you're right, like the animated films are hundreds of millions of files, potentially. Yeah, and it's heading towards billions of files for these really large films because of the number of assets and the resolutions, and obviously the speed with which you can create data with a lot of these automated systems, including games engines, and obviously more recently with stable diffusion. And there's also security elements to this as well. Where is the data? Who's got access to that data? Who moved the data? And obviously being able to do that on a global basis, seemingly working towards the objective of creating these engaging images and telling these engaging stories. So absolutely critical to have, a great versioning system, being able to track status, being able to queue and priority manage. If you've got a limited link and you want to move stuff at a certain speed, you need to be able to manage your queuing and priority management. You need an event system. You need to notify people when things have happened in an automated way. And just finishing on where you started, that dependency tracking and how the relationships between files, what they look like, how they exist, that's absolutely critical.
Thanks, Alex. Jase, I'm a little bit familiar with Perforce's Helix Core product, which is essentially a solution for the challenges that we're discussing. But for those who aren't familiar with it, can you tell us a little bit about Helix Core and where it sits in a production? Is it within a facility at the animation level? Is it, at the production level? Is it further on in post? Where does it actually sit? And how is Dell, I guess, a partner with you guys to deliver a solution, that's best in class?
Sure, yeah. So as far as how it works, I'll take a little bit of a step back.
Sure.
Where essentially it's based around this idea of wanting to have a single source of truth. So that, as Alex was mentioning, you've got all these different people and you want to make sure that they have the most up-to-date versions of everything. And so we can end up getting in trouble if we've got all these different places where someone stored something, or I'm working on a project and I'm referencing some files off of a shared storage with another person, some that are in my Dropbox and some that are on my local drive. And for me as a human, that's a really difficult thing to keep track of and make sure, because there's no single source of truth to tell me what's here is the latest, or what's here is exactly the version you asked for. And so that's the idea behind version control in general, and particularly a centralized version control system like Helix Core. So the idea is that you would have a server somewhere that's your central commit server, that it's the one that knows everything. It's the one that knows who all the users are, what files each user is allowed to access, what the latest versions of all of the files in all of the different projects are. You can, of course, have multiple servers that are linked to each other. So you could have a server in London and one in Australia and one in New York and one in LA, so that everyone has really fast access to it. And those all stay synced to each other. But there's always one that's kind of the mothership that knows the truth about everything, right? That single source of truth. And then as far as where that lives, that's one of the things where there's a lot of flexibility in terms of this could be something that you host locally for yourself. So really small independent productions might host this just on their own desktop computer at home, or maybe on a extra computer that they have sitting around in a VM or something like that. Or this could be in a data center, or it could be somewhere in the cloud. And as we all know, Dell shows up in all of those places in terms of providing that hardware for the thing that's going to be hosting your project.
Alex or Andy, do you want to talk about what Dell offers as far as a solution that can be paired with Perforce?
Sure. So there have been a few things that we've done, and obviously it depends on what you're doing with your version control system and how everything looks. But the reality is, as data sets grow, we need lots of capacity. We also need lots of performant capacity if we've got people working on really high-res images that are on shared storage. So the stuff that Alex and I have been working on is kind of how we can help people grow depot without downtime and that kind of stuff. So using PowerScale to do NFS or SMB offloaded depots, taking them away from block storage and chucking them on a big old scale out file system like PowerScale, so we can kind of grow those volumes as you need to without causing any outage to artist or production. While on the flip side, also, Dell have an entire portfolio of block storage and server and end user workstation. We can kind of do the whole thing. But the biggest problems that we're seeing and trying to address for people are, especially in the virtual production space, less so in the game development space, because they've been doing it for so long. They're kind of already used to moving stuff about and doing it in the ways that they do. But working with ridiculously large assets in a VFX type way. So, when everything's versioned and all is said and done, and you're going to DI or whatever, actually you're still going to be working on uncompressed 4K plates or 8K plates. You're going to be working on ridiculously high throughput stuff. We can do all of that from a single point of storage over 100 gig Ethernet back to a user's workstation. They work as if it's on their local workstation, that kind of stuff. That's kind of where we're heading towards in the market. I think we're going to end up where everything has to sit on something that's really high speed, available to everyone all the time, and version control basically just looks after it.
Jase, do you want to add to that in the sense that we're thinking about, these big animated features that have millions of assets, like Alex said, but you made it sound like it could be used on much smaller scale productions that maybe are not as dense as far as what the assets are. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. It's especially within the games industry, I find that everyone from a single person game studio all the way up to AAA studios will use Perforce for their version control, just because of the amount of reliability and experience. And if you're making a game that you might be spending years of your life on, you want it to be somewhere that you can trust to be reliable, and that is, I guess, battle tested, for lack of a better word. And it's kind of like, if you think about it in programming, that if one person is working on writing some scripts or writing a program, you might say, oh, well, they don't need version control. But almost everyone out there who is experienced is going to say, no, but you should anyway, because one of these days it's going to save your butt. And, I was actually just at a training a couple months ago for doing LED volume, in-camera VFX. And one of the people in the training ended up messing something up in his project that the whole class had to stop for 20, 30 minutes while the multiple instructors came over to help fix his project, where if we'd been using version control in that class, could have been a minute to just say, hey, actually get me back my changes from before. Okay, now we're good. Let's move on.
I was going to ask you, as far as version control, what does it mean for security or redundancy in a sense like that, where you do run into a problem? Is there a rollback where you can say we can go back to a certain place and at least we know everything is good from there forward or there backwards?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that when I think about projects that have, so many files in them, and even like we're talking about these things with hundreds of thousands of files, but even if you're working on a project with 50 files or something much smaller that seems more manageable, it still is that thing of, okay, I know that it worked at 2 p.m. yesterday
Mm-hmm.
and now it's not, but a bunch of stuff's happened since then. How can we figure out what it is that's wrong, right? That troubleshooting step can be painful, and if you're doing in-camera VFX, also incredibly expensive, because every minute that you've got the whole crew there on set is costing hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially. So in this case with version control, kind of like Alex and Andy were mentioning, that it is the one that manages, hey, what is the most recent? What are the files we need? And so you could literally just say, okay, we know this worked at 2 p.m. yesterday. Let's tell it, hey, give me everything as it was at 2 p.m. yesterday. Go. It gets you that version of all of the files at that point. Then you can open it up and say, okay, it's working. Great. Now let's see, what was the next change? Okay, let's load that in. Is it still working? Okay, great. Let's load in the next one. And you can kind of work your way back through actually seeing what each of the changes were. If you had no idea what it was, or if you knew it's okay, I think it's in this particular asset, that's where the problem is. You could do the same thing, but just saying, okay, let's roll this asset back and just look at how many times did this asset change and who changed it since yesterday at 2 p.m. Okay, that there was these two artists that worked on it. One did something that night and the other did something this morning. Let's go talk to them. Let's look at their changes and see which one broke it. So just giving you that kind of accountability and the safety to know that we can make big changes and try big things. And if it fails, we can get back to where we were before.
Is that the user's decision to decide how often that, stamp is put on, where, okay, it's every half hour, every 15 minutes, or, something that you've defined from a corporation standpoint where you feel this is the best practice for it?
Right. No, that is generally in the control of the user.
Okay.
So rather than it being something like every 30 minutes or every 15 minutes, the idea is that you're intentional about it. So if I have a task that I'm working on, I would say, okay, let me work on it till I've finished that task. And then I will submit this new version that has that task finished. And, if I'm using some kind of task tracking software like Jira or ShotGrid or something, I could also link those two things together so that I can help keep track of that, make it easier to look back and find it. But the idea is that unlike something like Google Drive or Dropbox or OneDrive, where it's just kind of always doing it for you in the background, in that case, or even working off of one network storage that's not using version control, where if I'm working on something and I break it, I screw up and I make a mistake, instantly everybody gets my broken version of this and everybody's sad. The number of times I've been in the VFX studio and literally at the same time, everyone turns to each other and said, did yours just crash? Yeah, mine crashed too. Yeah. What happened? Because someone deleted a folder they shouldn't have, or somebody messed up a file that they shouldn't have.
Gotcha.
And so, so version control makes it so you're more intentional about when am I sending a change in? I'm going to test it, make sure it works first, and then send it in. And then on top of that, can even give you extra separation where you can say, I'm sending it in to a work in progress stream. And then maybe my lead or a producer is going to review that before that gets copied up into the mainstream that might end up on the LED wall, or that might go to the render farm or something like that.
Okay, so it's not just going on in the background. The user or the artists have some knowledge that this is going on, and therefore when they are saving something, they know it's at that point that it's going to be reintroduced to the bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly. So then it also puts a little bit of responsibility on you to say, I want to make sure this works and it looks good before I submit it. The same as we would with submitting a render in more traditional post-production VFX, where, I know that if I submit my render and a producer opens it up and half my frames didn't render, I'm going to look bad, and that producer is going to be mad at me for wasting their time. So it's kind of a similar concept of as the artist, you want to make sure that it's in a good place before you submit it.
Perforce comes from the game design business and is in now the production and post business. Is that correct? Your history is in game design?
I mean, originally way back as software development, but been in the games industry for a couple decades now, at least.
Can you talk about any case studies or users, whether it's on the game side or the content production? Maybe I don't know if you can name names or not, but maybe the cases, how they're using it.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, on the game side, I think the number is somewhere like 8 or 9 out of the top 10 AAA studios all use Perforce and have for a long time. So basically all of the big name companies that you could think of that make games use Perforce, most likely. And so in that world, it's a very well-known quantity, at least within those larger companies. And as I mentioned, even sometimes in the indie game developers. It's funny, I was watching a YouTube video where game developers watch speedrunners play their games and kind of remark at the weird bugs that speedrunners are able to find to complete their games faster. And it was with the developers of Portal and Portal 2 from Valve. And in the video, they were saying, oh yeah, in the second one, that bug doesn't work anymore. You know what? We should go look back through our Perforce history and figure out who fixed that so we could mention them on this. And just, it's like such a part of their culture and their vernacular, knowing that even 10, 20 years back, they have history of who changed what file when for the whole thing, which is really cool. Yeah. As far as more recent examples in film, one that comes to mind that I think is really exciting is a company called XR Studios that's based in Hollywood. They do a lot of like extended reality things for broadcast TV, music videos, sports, as well as some film work as well. And for them, unlike a VFX studio where you might be working on something for several months, or a game studio where we might work on the same game for 10 years or longer as we just keep updating it and patching it and adding more things to it, that they were working on a new project at least once a week. So massive amounts of data coming in from different vendors and needing to be able to get up and running quickly and to be able to distribute that to all of the networked computers that are doing the rendering for the LED wall. That by working with them, I actually went down to their studio and we worked on automating a lot of that. We got their setting up of a new project from being something that takes a few hours of an admin's time to get that set up and get all the new users set up to something that takes, I think, 30 seconds.
Helix Core is version control, and you have another product that's asset management. Is that the case?
We have a digital asset management tool. I think of it as kind of an add-on to Helix Core. And I think that's part of the appeal for game studios and film studios that are starting to look at it, is that you've got all of your versions of everything stored in Helix Core in version control. And what DAM does, the digital asset management tool does, is it adds the ability to do a number of things to manage your assets within that, while still having all the advantages of version control for storing those assets. So one of the things it does is it adds a searchable web interface of all of your assets with thumbnails, as well as the ability to send those out to have them tagged by AI automatically. So for example, we have a bunch of different models of all sorts of things that our studio has built over the years. And if I want to find a chair or a 57 Chevy or whatever it is, I can actually just search for that with words, and either through manual tagging or AI tagging or a combination of the two, I'm able to find those. So rather than spending some time going and looking at marketplaces to buy a new asset or making a new one from scratch, I can see, oh, we already have one. Let me just take that, or maybe branch it and adapt it, make some changes for this scene but it allows me to reuse those assets that we already have and that have been vetted. It also gives you ways that people who are less technical are able to view those assets and look through them. So one example is it's possible to export your 3D objects so that they can be previewed live in the web browser by users that have permission for it. So they could actually rotate around the object, look at it, and then give their feedback and notes right there in the web interface, that then the actual artist who's working on it can see those changes and then load it up in version control, make changes, submit those, and then that will update for the person who's reviewing it. So it's adding on several features like that. I could go on about various different things that it does, but that's kind of the idea, is sort of adding this digital asset management feature set on top of what you're already hopefully using for managing your versions.
You mentioned a really interesting bit there, which is totally game development, like influencing VFX now, which is branching and like code related stuff, which is like, well, we got this thing, actually, we just want to change it. So we'll leave it as it is and then just edit it down to perfect. It's things like that where actually that was never a thing in VFX, right? It's like, if you want to do this, you get the original, like we do it, we would branch, but it'd be a manual process of basically taking all the assets, getting it in somewhere else, editing them again, and then you've got a whole new version. It's like, well, we could just use the original version of reference. And it's exactly that kind of stuff where we're now seeing the big kind of almost transmutation into what is coming. It's like, well, we can use both techniques actually really well with each other. It's a massive learning curve.
I'm always curious to hear your thoughts for the year ahead. Every month I'm covering news of new virtual production stages that are opening, and it'll be interesting to see what is being produced. What are your thoughts on the content and the technology we'll be seeing in the near future?
I can start with that one. My view on it is that game engine technology is essentially democratizing creation. So it's opening up. It's not, as you alluded to, it's not just these very large global studios that can afford this. This is down to the individual level, and it's in doing that, it's creating more content, more diverse content. And allowing people to explore their creative ideas when they never had a chance before, because the bar to entry is much lower. And I think that's fantastic. So for the larger studios, it's about pipeline optimization, doing things faster, being able to iterate faster, explore more in a shorter period of time. For the individual, it's actually, the bar to entry is now low enough that they can actually express their creative vision. And I think that's brilliant. So I expect to see a lot more diverse content coming from lots of different places that we never saw it before. And there are already examples of individuals creating feature-length, CG films that are good enough quality to get, funding for new ones from the streaming providers. And that's created by one guy and a few artists over a couple of years. So the power is in the hands of people with creative ideas now, which I think was absolutely brilliant. There was one other thing that's sort of, I suppose, digresses a little bit from the original comment, but I did want to make it before we wrapped up. One of the things that we haven't talked about is talent, and talent within the industry has been increasingly more challenging. By that, I mean, it's harder to hire and retain talent in certain areas of content creation. One of those areas is R&D talent. There's a lot of jobs everywhere for R&D or developers. And so typically in the mid to large studios, they've built their own asset management systems, or change management systems. And that's required a lot of people with constant updates. And it obviously comes with a lot more risk in terms of, it's not standardized. It doesn't necessarily have the right or current cyber, approaches. So I think that what Perforce brings to this, both the game dev and the real-time space, is a standardized framework and techniques, providing essentially growing communities of people a very clear way forward to manage their assets, their data, while also extracting much, much deeper and more usable metadata to add things like automation to their creative processes.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Jase or Andy, anything to add? What your vision is for the years or months ahead?
I mean, I want to see where Gen AI goes. It's gonna be an interesting while, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think Alex kind of hit most of it on the head. The reality is we're seeing a lot of cross-pollination of talent now across game and film, and I think it's a good thing, right? We've had two very distinct disciplines for a long time. You know, you're a game artist, that's where you live, get in your box, and now all of a sudden you can fly both sides, and actually it's awesome.
Yeah. You think about the AI and how companies may use it to gain a competitive advantage, but then do you let anybody know that you're using it, because then they can use it to gain the same type of advantage over it? So like it's available to everybody, and therefore isn't an advantage at that point. That'll be interesting to see how that's used.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to what Alex mentioned about game engines helping to democratize film production as well. That I think it's just a continuation of this trend that we've already seen, where years ago, to even make a little short film, you needed quite a lot of capital to be able to fund that, to now where someone can make an award-winning short film on their smartphone, right? That technology has made things more accessible to more people, which gives us better diversity and more voices in terms of the art that we have in the world. And we're seeing that too with game studios, where we can have these 1-person, 2-person, 5-person game studios that are able to use software like Unity or Unreal Engine because of their pricing models, and using Perforce. We're free for 5 or fewer users, so that those indie studios can use that and get started and try out their projects and get familiar with it. And of course, free for universities as well, so that they can get started on helping to educate their students on how to actually properly use version control, because it is such a key skill when you get into the professional world. I just, sorry, there was one other thing I was going to say. Yeah, on the AI piece, something there is that when these AI tools come along, they're very cool. And, if someone says, oh, we're using this tool and it's boosted our productivity, great, that's cool. But what I think really empowers certain studios and companies more than others is the data that they have to give the AI for it to learn from and to develop things either in their style or able to be trained in particular ways of working. And so if you think about a studio, like I mentioned, Valve in that YouTube video mentioned Perforce going back at least 10 years with their versions. That's a lot of data they have, that even if I know they're using such and such AI to do their work now, I don't have all their data. And so having something like Perforce that gives you that ability to have all that archival data and all of that information about the metadata about it as well can be incredibly powerful, even for small studios, when it comes to customizing those AI tools for their own workflows.
Interesting. Yeah. Again, gentlemen, thank you for your time. Jase, Alex, Andy, we appreciate your insight on this topic, and hopefully we can talk again down the road and see how much of that pans out and what else you guys got coming up.
Always a pleasure, Marc. Thank you again for having us.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks so much, Marc.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Andy. Have a great night, guys.